I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
Exactly how do you mean?
There's a great future in plastics. Think about it. Will you think about it?
Yes, I will.
Enough said. That's a deal.
Plastics have reshaped our world. It's almost unimaginable that when single-use plastics first rolled out to market in the mid-20th century, companies had to teach people to throw them away. Since 2000, more than half the world's plastic has been created, a startling sign that plastic pollution isn't just an ongoing problem, but a growing one. Today, we're talking about how plastic came to be such a fundamental part of life, and the effect plastics have on our sense of the world, and the real harms they take on human and environmental health. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our May Fund Drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. In the coming weeks, Gulf Streams will feature conversations with experts on greenwashing, urban sprawl, and coal pollution. If you want to become a station sustainer, ask about our memory bricks, permanent inscribed tributes to your generosity here at the studio. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn about all the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We're delighted to bring you important conversations about environmental and climate issues here in Houston and beyond on Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please, call 713-526-KPFT, make a one-time or subscriber donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help us keep ad-free public radio on the air here in Houston. A quick reminder that you can catch up with Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Campana, who is the director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies. And the two of us are going to sit down and have a conversation with Dr. Heather Davis, who is assistant professor of culture and media at the New School in New York. And Dr. Davis's work draws on ecology, materiality. She thinks about contemporary art. She thinks a lot about a lot of different things to think about, in particular, plastic in her latest book, Plastic Matter, that thinks through geology, media, bodies of light, all to understand both the harmful impacts of plastic on our world and our human health, but also how it's reshaped our understanding of the world and how plastic has entered into the world and our culture in ways that have fundamentally made us rethink our relationship to the way we create material and how we live on this planet. Heather Davis, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm delighted to be speaking with you. And I know Joe Campana, who's on with us as well, is also really keen to get to chat. I'm wondering if you could just introduce yourself and your work a little bit to us briefly, just to get a little familiarity with what you're thinking about.
Sure. I am an assistant professor of culture and media at the New School in New York. And I became obsessed with plastic maybe about a little over 10 years ago. And so I'm really interested in some of the cultural implications of plastic and how it comes to sort of operate as such a predominant material of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Well, great. Heather, welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you about your fantastic book, but also to talk about this subject. It's one that I approach often through thinking about waste, right? Which is this perversely capacious term. It's just really, it sometimes refers to the passage of time or the use of money or other resources. It refers to land. It refers to so many things. And most often it refers to what we tend to call junk, rubbish, trash, right? And there's a whole sort of field that emerged out of sociology, obviously called discard studies, right? That's one way of thinking through these objects. As I was rereading your book, I was thinking a lot about the fact that plastic too is one of these terms that's insanely capacious. It means so many different things. And it is both a kind of set of complicated material things, but also there's a sort of fantasy with it. With waste, the fantasy is often away. I can send this away from me. I can live in a kind of clean, pure space. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and it's something I think you get at so nicely in your book, Plastic Matter. What is sort of some of the fantasies around plastic? We'll definitely get to the materialities, but some of the fantasies around that idea.
I mean, I think a couple of the fantasies around plastic that I was particularly interested in thinking with was obviously, this word plastic wasn't originally meant to talk about synthetic chemicals or synthetic products. It was originally used to describe the ability to mold or shape. Um, and then later it was used to describe the plastic arts. So like various kinds of fine arts practices, especially sculpture and things like that. Um, and I think that when people were creating what we now know as plastics, so the kind of full range of fossil fuel based synthetic polymers that we live with in all kinds of objects and materials around us, that a lot of those ideas of what it means to be shaped or to be molded were also imported into that material. So in particular, like this idea of kind of infinite malleability, this idea of like having something that's sort of formless, this idea that like, one of the things that I was really interested in when I first started researching plastic was something that I got from a French philosopher, Bernadette Bensaud-Vincent, who talks about how plastic was the first time that you could shape both form and matter simultaneously, like as a material, because up until that point, what you had was things like, wood or steel or other things that had their own kind of material affordances, but you were really limited by what those materials could actually do. Now, plastic comes along and you could say, well, I want the material to be able to do, I want it to be heat resistant, and you could just make it heat resistant. So in addition to be able to create whatever form or shape you want it to look like. And so there's this kind of heightened extension of an idea of everything being pliable, everything being malleable. And I think this is a fantasy that extends everything from the ways in which labor is organized under capitalism. So how we're all kind of, invited, conscripted to be working sort of all of the time, right? To sort of be infinitely malleable to various kinds of workplace scenarios and schedules, but also to the ways in which we really think about matter and materials around us as being infinitely malleable. So thinking about the ways in which, after the birth of plastics, we really end up in this century where we're thinking a lot with questions of CRISPR and other kinds of genetic editing softwares and technologies. So I think that there's a way in which this kind of idea of plastic isn't just about the material, but is really about a kind of orientation to how we think about the world around us more generally, and specifically what matter is and what it can do.
Oh, and something, I mean, that I think you're pointing to there is this kind of fantasy of control, right? That we can reshape and remake anything into anything. And there's a kind of futurism to that seems really, oh, we can generate whatever and it's magically possible. But I think what you're hinting at is that actually the stretch of that matter is, there's only so far we can push that. And there's certain things that are not malleable and certain things we don't want to be malleable in that way. Am I reading you right there?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. I mean, obviously it's cool. Like it's great to be able to, make things malleable and bendable and like, all that stuff that's wonderful. But there are definitely certain kinds of limits, and I think there's consequences to thinking in that way, which I think is part of what we're bumping up against.
This also might be where a term that you use a number of times and that people are talking about, techno-utopianism, might come in. Maybe you could talk a touch about that, and it seems to relate to this question of the fantasy of not just infinitely malleable materials, but that you can make anything you want out of them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know where techno-utopianism is such a great term. I have no idea where it actually originated from. Maybe do you know?
I don't actually know.
Okay, so this is like a task for both for
Let's
all of
all
us.
Google.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know where, yeah, I don't know where it comes from. I mean, obviously, it's like technological utopia, right? It's like the kind of mashup of these two words, but I think it's like mostly associated, or at least in my mind, I'd love to hear what you all think about that term. But in my mind, the image that really immediately comes to mind, or the person who really comes to mind, is like Elon Musk, right? Like it's almost like he embodies techno-utopianism, right? There's no limits to anything. We'll all just fly up into outer space. Everything's going to be great. We don't have to worry about planetary boundaries. We don't have to worry about, anything. We'll all be amazing in our self-driving cars and live off of some unknown source of electricity. And and there's like, I think like that is sort of the extreme version of what techno-utopianism is. But I do think it's just sort of more in maybe a much more banal sense, and also maybe more consequential, maybe not. I don't know. I think these things feed into each other. But in something like the ways in which in the IPCC reports,
Can you
there's
clarify for folks who aren't familiar with the IPCC what that
oh,
is?
right, the International Panel on Climate Change in their various reports on how the world is going to stay within 2 degrees Celsius of warming. There is in each one of those reports, there's a built-in assumption that we are going to be able to expand carbon capture and storage technologies to scale to be able to fix this and or at least keep within those limits. And the problem is that that technology doesn't actually exist at the moment, at least not to the scale at which it's necessary. And so that would be another example of what it's meant by techno-utopianism, like, oh, it's fine. We don't have to worry about continued extraction because we'll be able to capture it all. Except, at the moment, that's like definitively a fantasy because we don't even have the technology to do so. So, yeah, just this kind of perpetual sort of deferral and belief that that no matter what, we'll find some kind of technology to save us.
I think that's really significant because I think it is one of the things that we often point to as, oh, well, we'll just invent our way out of climate change, right? We'll just find these solutions. We'll come up with the ideas. And it's something that, carbon capture, to your point, is something we've talked about previously in the program. I'd encourage listeners to go back and listen to some of those episodes. But, unlike other certain forms of, say, solar energy, right, which we see were very expensive when they debuted in the 50s and are now amongst the cheapest forms of energy, carbon capture has not changed in pricing in 70 years of research. And so the idea that there is, and similarly, we hear about this with, certain bridge fuels or bridge systems that are going to take us, and there are real questions about, well, what is that bridge to? And this, what you're proposing is this kind of, techno-utopian talk, I think really highlights this. Well, it becomes a useful kind of imaginary or placeholder, but that's dangerous because then it lets us pretend that's the next logical step when we have no idea what that looks like, and maybe even digging into that reality of the utopic as, yeah, it's nowhere, right? It's no place, it doesn't exist, and that's a dangerous thing to try to build a future around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I had no idea that the price point hadn't changed in 70 years. That's wild.
Yeah, it has not. And it's also, I
Wow.
will say, it's something we mentioned before, is in talking with some folks on the kind of oil and gas side of these conversations, it's increasingly something that many folks I know are now kind of saying we have to pivot to other conversations because this is not proven successful enough in a way that it's a viable stepping stone, and so there's looking at, well, maybe the agricultural industry, which is a large chunk of where climate emissions come from, but rather than trying to address the kind of fossil fuel crisis, there's increasingly conversations about what are other sectors we could use reduction in that are maybe more achievable than exactly relying on these technologies that we assumed by now would be, somewhat viable, and instead of have proven really not efficacious or in any way cost effective enough to roll out in the near decades.
Wow. It kind of reminds me of my dad worked in the nuclear industry for a long time, and he would make this joke about fission reactors. Or no, sorry. Fission reactors. I always get it confused. But where no, it's fusion. Which one is
Yeah.
the one we don't actually have?
We don't have cold
Fusion.
fusion. That's
We don't
the
have cold
constant
fusion.
dream.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. He would make the joke about cold fusion that it was like always 20 years out. It doesn't matter what decade you're in. The technology was always going to happen 20 years in the future. It could be the 1990s or the 2020s. It doesn't matter.
You know, Heather, something I was also thinking about in your book, and also to hear kind of the time frame you've been sort of thinking through this issue over, say, about a decade, and certainly in the last 10 years, kind of a burst of environmental reporting. Not that it was new, obviously, but more intensive. And so the reporting on plastics has been kind of extraordinary and increasing. I get whole newsletters just on plastics, environmental plastics issues. And it's a sort of the way at this current moment where the kind of pervasiveness of it collides with the fact that it's been kind of turned into a necessity over time. And I was thinking about a particular moment, you write kind of really beautifully in the introduction about a kind of push-pull relationship we have to plastics now. This is the sort of your moment. We fear being smothered in plastic in its sticky, sleek surfaces, our bodies invaded by this foreign alien material, yet we are also attracted to it, and especially to its promises of a clean, sanitary, sterilized life. I'd just love to have you talk about that, amplify that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right to point out, thanks for reading that passage. I think that you're right to point out that in the last 10 years, there's been a really significant shift. I think it's been really remarkable to see, actually, from my point of view. When I started doing this research and this work, there was the occasional news story. It wasn't like it was a kind of non-issue, but it really kind of was like very, very captured by that framing of the plastics industry that we just had to recycle, everything would be fine. And that clearly hasn't ever been true. It certainly continues to not be true. But I think that's precisely the tension, right? Is that especially in the 1950s and 1960s, when you go back and look at the advertising, then what was really being sold was both a kind of ideal of a certain kind of democratic accessibility to materialism, right, or to consumption, so that everyone could have a kind of a luxury good, right, was sort of the ways in which it was thought about, and also that everyone could have access to disposability, which is kind of which was a really wild idea at that time, right? Like no one was throwing things out in the post-war period, right? Like that is not something that people were doing. So this idea that you could have this kind of sense of both disposability, abundance, and also a sense of maintaining a literal barrier often between ourselves and the processes of decay or decomposition is something that plastic really embodied, or really, it was really sold to the public in that way. And I think that it still definitely holds that kind of imaginary, especially we saw this as one of the real levers that the plastic industry pushed in relationship to COVID-19, even though it was just like not true that that plastic surfaces were safer or for us than other types of surfaces, or also that plexiglass in front of store workers, for example, there were some studies that were showing that was actually making COVID transmission worse rather than better because of the airflow and the way it would concentrate air pockets. So there's all these ways in which it is pitched to the public in one way. We have a certain kind of imaginary that it's going to protect us, but in fact it often does the opposite. And I think now people are really concerned about plastic and plastic toxicity and plastic chemicals, the chemicals associated with plastics. I think there's a lot more general public concern about this, and I think this is a real real result of the amount of really good public reporting there has been on plastics and what they're doing in the world, and how pervasive they are.
I wonder if you can talk a little more about, because you have, beautiful things that you talk about. I mean, beautifully written things you talk about in the book, really terrifying things, but, really focusing on some local communities who are experiencing the effects of both plastic production There's a part where you talk about Teflon that, I am aware that, these kind of non-stick pans are terrible for me, and I got rid of them some years back, and yet you still managed to completely terrify me into running and checking all my pans the other night, to make sure I'm not using anything that might have Teflon. That was really just quite harrowing. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little about some of these implications in your research that you are, reading and bringing in and thinking about what are the human and, larger environmental concerns around the manufacture of plastic.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I should say is that like not all plastics are the same. Like polypropylene is relatively safe. Polyethylene terephthalate is relatively safe. Other ones like PVC are really bad. I don't know why they still exist. There's campaigns at the moment led by Beyond Plastics and other activist organizations that are trying to lobby the EPA to get PVC banned as a material. And this is in part because of the vinyl monomer that is used in the manufacturing of PVC, and this is it has been a known carcinogen and like a known not only carcinogen, but like it causes all kinds of other problems in the human body. And this has been well documented since the 1970s. And even though the amount that workers are meant to be exposed to has significantly lowered over time, what you end up with is situations where those workers are still exposed over prolonged periods of time. And then the other problem is that you also end up with communities that are around those factories that are also exposed. And those communities don't necessarily have any control over how much they're being exposed and the kind of consequences of their exposure. And in some of the worst cases, like in the case of, Mossville in Louisiana, or in the case of Parkersburg in West Virginia, in Mossville, that's a whole host of petrochemical industries that are down there, including a bunch of PVC manufacturing. But the town was essentially asked to close and leave and go somewhere else because of the amount of toxicity in the air. Those people were just getting so sick. And it's devastating because this is a town that had been a free Black town since the 1700s.
Wow.
And had continuously been a place of Black thriving. And you can see the kinds of patterns of environmental racism that happen, that are sort of continuous with the plantation system in relationship to where the petrochemical factories then end up being located in relationship to Louisiana. And in this case, then what ends up happening is, even though this one particular community managed to sort of escape some of that for a very long time, they eventually were displaced because of petrochemical from these petrochemical companies. Now, there's also, I should say, a lot of resistance to this. And, in nearby communities, there's an amazing organization led by Sharon Levine, who just became one of the Time 100 People of the Year, very, very well-deserved, who is an incredible campaigner for her community, who has really managed to, so far, stave off the building of yet another petrochemical factory that is going to happen in and around southern Louisiana, where she lives. And so you can see the kinds of ways in which this exacerbates ongoing racial and class disparities. So in the case of Parkersburg, West Virginia, there's a film that was recently made called Dark Waters. And that documents that entire case, and it's devastating to watch. It's also infuriating because DuPont knew that the manufacture of C8 and the manufacture of Teflon have been harmful to human health since the beginning of their manufacturing. And in fact, when I was going through the records of folks who worked at DuPont in the plastics industry, in the plastics section of DuPont, there was a series of oral histories that are a part of the Hagley archives, which are the company's official archives. And in there was a worker who described the ways in which he said he knew that Teflon was always harmful to human health. And of course, we've known since the beginning of its manufacture that if you happen to have pet birds, you can't have it inside because your pet bird will immediately die. So it's literally like the canary in the coal mine situation. And and yet, in the description, he sort of says like, okay, well, our internal memos at DuPont said this should definitely not be used in any kind of cooking situation. And then, and then goes on to say like, oh, and then all of a sudden, all of these pans were being shipped, pans and muffin tins and, whatever else are all being shipped from France coated in this material. And yeah, this obviously affects specific communities the most, like the communities where these chemicals are being dumped or communities that are in proximity to sites of production. It's all obviously affecting workers the most, people who work in petrochemical industries and who are working in those factories and in those plants, often for not very much money. But it's also affecting everybody, right? So even if the rest of us aren't being exposed at the same levels, it's still really serious cause for concern. So there's definitely certain types of plastics that are way worse than others. But yes, anything with a kind of vinyl monomer or chlorine or anything that's a phthalate or anything, it's kind of a whole host of different, anything that's a PFAS or type of chemical, all of those are well documented to be harmful to humans.
Nice. Yeah. You're also reminding me this. So something that I was thinking about reading your book also, I just have a fascination with Life magazine, kind of, we're talking about late 30s to 1980. And it's largely, yes, it's what's covered, it's how things are covered, right? I was pulling an issue just to see if I could pop quickly to a kind of an ad from one that I happen to have right here. But it's the advertisements that are fascinating. And it kind of, again, it turns into a couple things that I think are really important in your book, right? Which is to suggest that there's a certain kind of 20th century America that is unimaginable without plastics, and it was made that way, right? Because it was marketed, because it was central to so many objects and sort of technologies that became important. I started kind of just pulling out some of them, kind of just the names as I was thinking through the book. Bakelite in 1907, cellulose nitrate in 27, nylon 1930. Imagine the world without nylon. And so there's a certain kind of way in which, again, that it's fascinating to think about. Even before, I think you kind of mark around 1971 when there's finally a kind of plastics council that's really working on the kind of publicity for the industry. There's sort of decades of advertisements, entertainment. You mentioned the kind of the scene from The Graduate. I was thinking about Billy Wilder's Sabrina, which is obsessed with plastics, which they claim is going to be anything you want it to be and made out of sugarcane. I mean, it's like, that's a whole nother story, but it's fascinating. It was fascinating to kind of think through this like sort of 20th to 21st century kind of trajectory for America, North America, especially, not to exclude other places, but the other places are basically where the waste is often sent. That's its own kind of conversation. But this kind of evolution over the kind of 20th century through plastics, through its marketing, its advertising, but also through the development of these technologies, it's a sort of fascinating way of thinking of the history of North America and then its impact kind of globally.
So you bringing up Sabrina, I had completely forgotten about the bulletproof plastic scene, and oh my goodness, that
Unbelievable.
is, yeah. If listeners haven't watched that classic Audrey Hepburn, William Holden's in it, and Humphrey Bogart,
Humphrey
yeah,
Bogart, yes.
outstanding, wonderful, wonderful movie. That's our rec for the
1954.
day.
Yes, 1954, and watch the original. Don't watch the remake. Sorry. Anyway, but it's a way of saying there's just you're actually also tracing on kind of North American history of the 20th century through the book, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, there's also other amazing things like the Monsanto House of the Future. If you've ever looked at that one, I totally recommend
No.
Googling that as well. It's like this kind of futuristic, like 1960s. It was built in 1957, but it was an attraction at Disneyland's Tomorrowland.
Oh,
And it
wow.
was really kind of like meant to be the future. It kind of really looks like the Jetsons, but in real life. And everything, literally everything in it is made of plastic. Like it's all blow molded.
Mm.
Like it's kind of seamless. Like the whole thing is like a weird seamless, like the kind of thing that I think we would imagine now, except out of mushrooms or something. Like, but back then it was plastic. So I mean, yeah, you're completely right. I think that there's like an amazing kind of history of like specifically, I think American culture, but also a certain kind of American aesthetics that you can also trace through the movements in modernist and contemporary art as well, that that is really taking up the kind of aesthetics of plastic, right? Like the everything is all of a sudden so bright. You know, it could be intensely bright, it can be intensely colorful, it can be blow molded, it can be shaped in all of these incredible ways. You know, everything from sort of, you know, Andy Warhol's work to Eva Hesse's work, you know, all of to Noam Galbo's work, like all of this is not really possible without all of these materials that we think of as plastic.
Yeah. Reminding me too of a kind of really wonderful moment in your writing. I mean, it comes back to what we talked about a little earlier, techno-utopianism, essentially a kind of science fiction, right? That is science, but also the idea of disposability. Actually, even as plastic kind of completely marks the 2021st century in these complicated ways, it's also a substance and a fantasy that seems to erase it. So you write, plastic fits within a blind drive towards the future, where the present is constantly being discarded and the past has ceased to exist. And with also those little glimpses of the future world you can live in, which is clean and plastic and, you know, actually not unlike the world as it's already evolving, but it's already couched as if it's the future.
Yeah, exactly. And it's already like, I mean, I think that one of the real differences, or maybe like, I mean, actually, I would love to know what happened to the Monsanto House of the Future. That would be a fantastic kind of thing to go and discover. But it's also like, you know, in part when I was writing that sentence, I was really actually thinking about like the wall of choice about toothbrushes, you know, like and this is my own specific, you know, consumer blockage or something, but it's like, you know, like you go into the drugstore, wherever you're going to buy toothbrushes, and there are so many different toothbrushes and they all look exactly the same. And as far as I can tell, they all do the exact same thing. And and I don't really understand what any of that, like, I mean, obviously there's like minute differences, but it's basically the same object, but just like repeated in all these different kinds of variations. And it's both this thing that's kind of like constantly inviting you to a new sense of a kind of a new temporal sense, right? Like that there isn't a moment where you're just kind of like there with your toothbrush. It's more like, oh, there's this constant endless flood of toothbrushes that are coming at you, that you're always being invited into a world of better toothbrushes, you know, and it's just like, for some reason that the toothbrush just, I know it's the most kind of ridiculous consumer object, but it's the one that like really gets in my head when I think about this kind of like endlessly replicating present that isn't really a present, right? Like, I mean, I think when we think about the word present, we think about presence, we think about yeah, like a sense of fulsomeness, right? And there's a sense of yearning that's always embedded, obviously, in this kind of mode of commodity production. And that sense of yearning, that sense of being pulled in, that sense of like constantly discarding and moving forward, that sense of this a kind of endless flow of consumer goods that all seem to have the exact same function. You know, all of this it feels like it's this draw towards a future that never actually arrives. Like it's just a perpetual anticipation that never actually arrives, but that we're being pulled into in that kind of sense of being pulled into a no place or a nowhere that Utopia describes.
I wanna pick up on a thread of that, and I think, you know, your toothbrush banal example is actually really perfect for just that kind of mass production that gets at some of what Joe had brought up at the beginning around waste, right? And where does this plastic go? And I think, you know, you had mentioned at one point that disconnect of plastic from decay and decomposition, which I'd like to revisit a little bit, because I think it is one of the things we don't tend to go into Walgreens and, you know, look at the row of toothbrushes and think this is going to exist in some fashion for 430 years. I mean, that's really a different way of understanding those objects. And, you know, everything you've been talking about, like this history of making plastic normal, making plastic the future, making plastic, ubiquitous in these ways allows for our engagement with these objects without thought and with that kind of waste process to occur. And so I'm wondering if you can talk some about the consequences of this mass production of plastic. And I think people are certainly familiar with, images of these massive trash heaps, but where is this waste going? What is happening around it? And some of that's even kind of interesting in an evolutionary sense that you write about, but some of it's also just really terrifying. And hopefully we'll get to plastic glomerates, which both horrify me and fascinate me now that I've learned about them through your work. I'd love to hear about some of these long impacts of plastic and waste as we've created this system.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that sort of occurred to me when I was originally sort of thinking about plastic and waste and the kind of processes of decay. I mean, basically, as far as I understand it, no one can give like really good answers about how long plastic products will be around for. We haven't had them long enough to be able to really do the kinds of material analysis and to understand actually how they operate in different types of conditions. Some plastics, like, have totally already spontaneously broken apart. This is actually a real problem in terms of the world of conservation for design history and for art objects. Some of those mid-century plastic objects have completely decomposed, or rather, I should say, they got a lot smaller. I don't know if they've actually decomposed. They've definitely changed chemical and material form, and what exactly has become of them, I think, is still a little bit under debate. But sort of similar to that, it's like, when we think of what it means to decompose, right? I think what we're often talking about is there is another organism that can successfully digest whatever it is whatever kinds of materiality we have, right? And that organism then can change the chemical properties of whatever it is it digests, and then it changes into something else and it becomes something different. And then the problem with plastic is that most of it, under most conditions, doesn't do this. Most of it just massively accumulates. There's, very famous statistics, like 91% of plastic ever made has not been recycled. And so either, and then a small portion of that has been incinerated, and then the rest is just still here. Like, it's all just still here. So since, the beginning of the 20th century, we just have all of this plastic that is just still with us, and accumulating in huge proportions, because it's not like any of this is slowing down. In fact, it's massively speeding up. This is, in fact, the kind of the saving grace of the fossil fuel industry, is that they are going to turn more and more and more to plastics production, to petrochemical production. This is what they explicitly say in their reports, right? So there's a huge investment in this industry. This is not in any way, shape, or form going away. It's becoming more and more of a problem. More and more is being produced, and under those circumstances, it means that there's just more and more and more accumulating. And sort of famously, a lot, or infamously, a lot of this has ended up in Southeast Asia. Much of it used to go to China, but then in 2019, China had an import ban, which really actually radically reshaped a lot of countries' associations with their waste management systems. And this is also the reason why a lot of people who work in plastic policy initiatives and other kinds of activism are trying to also get the amount of plastics that are produced to be reduced. So if we could actually have more standardized production of plastics, if there wasn't the seventh catch-all category that God knows what that is, like that's, it's like anything that is some kind of synthetic polymer.
Sorry,
that
can you talk through that a little bit more, just for folks who don't know what you mean by the seven catch-all category?
Oh, right. So like if you look on the bottom of, your yogurt container or something, it will have a little symbol on it that has little arrows, and it has a number in the middle of that symbol. And it's 1 through 7. 1 through 6 are known plastics. And the seventh category is the category of everything else. Everything else means, one of thousands of different types of polymers. So it's really anything. And this is a huge problem if you actually ever want to create any kind of circular economy, if you actually ever wanted to take seriously processes of recycling, for example. And what's really interesting is that when people do processes of recycling in ways that are actually sustainable and where the people are getting like, you know, a living wage, there's some artists who've started doing this. For example, Gary Dusek and his studio in the Bronx in New York City, who's affiliated with Precious Plastics. They at his studio, when he actually recycles everything by hand and then, you know, creates a hanger, the hanger costs $35, right? And so I think what this shows us is the ways in which if we were actually to take recycling seriously in terms of actually paying people well, making sure that they're working in non-toxic conditions, and actually taking seriously what it means to recycle a material that's actually very, very difficult to recycle. It's pretty recalcitrant as a material. You end up with very expensive objects. They're bespoke objects. And in some ways, like if we were to actually think about plastics in that way, we would have a radically different world. But also sort of thinking about some of the things you were inviting me to talk about, which was, you know, one of the other things that happens in terms of kind of questions of decomposition is that there actually are all of these organisms that have successfully developed to be able to decompose plastics. So there's a number of different kinds of mycelium. There's mealworms, there's waxworms, there's other kinds of bacteria that exist that can successfully decompose plastics. This isn't at scale in any way, so this is in no way, shape, or form a kind of solution to the problem of plastic waste. But it is fascinating. It's fascinating to see the ways in which, you know, various kinds of microorganisms and mycelium are incredibly adept at being able to access energy stores in the world, and fossil fuels are an incredibly good energy store. So of course something would adapt to be able to eat it. What that means 450 years into the future, I have absolutely no idea. You know, and then there's all kinds of other strange things, like specific types of you know, like reef communities that have developed because of the amount of plastic trash in the ocean, where like there's like these kinds of fishes that usually are only found along shores, but all of a sudden they're found way out into the ocean, because they can kind of recreate a shoreline with the plastic trash that's there. And, you know, like just like totally bizarre things like that, I don't know if I would put it under the category of hope, but at least it's interesting. You know, there's something really fascinating about it.
You know, it suggests something, and this is something very, I think, powerful towards the end of your book, especially, which is it's less of a sense of try to draw the positive lessons of, or look, here's the kind of plastic apocalypse we're in. It's easy to feel, you know, that, but on the other hand, you suggest that so that actually what we're doing is we're living with plastics, right? And yes, that means we need some solutions to problems that are arising, and there's sort of toxicity, and some communities within North America are affected more than others. And then many people outside of North America have been affected by the kind of global recycling scam, essentially, of the last couple decades. But you seem to you suggest sort of very interestingly, it is about thinking about what are these forms of life emerging? What is it to be living with plastics? Because we are going to be, like with so many other environmental conditions that humans have created, we're going to be living with them. And so I appreciate like just the push you give us, the nudge you give us to try to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's precisely as you laid out, right? It's like there's no going back. Even if we were to go back, like a lot of our ideas about, I think, what like nature is, or about a kind of access to a certain kind of purity politics, for example, where one can live in like a clean, you know, sealed, non-decomposing world. You know, like I'm really trying to suggest that actually some of those fantasies are what has led to this moment, right? Rather than the reverse, which is so if part of those fantasies of what has led us into this predicament, then it seems like actually what we really need to do is develop patterns of living and sociality that embrace the kind of real porousness of our bodies. Like, you know, I really think if we really took seriously, I mean, especially if industry executives, petrochemical industry executives really took seriously the fact that they were also going to be exposed to these chemicals, and there are children and their loved ones of all kinds. if they really took seriously the kind of porosity of their own body, like would our world be so saturated in these deadly chemicals? I mean, I would hope not. Who knows? But because these are incredibly profitable things, so maybe that would trump everything. I don't know, but I do think that there's a certain kind of dynamic, like a certain kind of shift that we have to undergo in relationship to really like not just trying to push these problems away, but to really figure out how we are going to live with them and live with them in ways that are less harmful than what we've been doing.
Well, I'm wondering, I think this is a good space to go back to that question on plastic agglomerates that you bring up and think about, and really, I think, embody in a way all of these ideas about that longevity and this, new nature that we're experiencing. So could you define that term for us? And then could you talk to us a little bit about what that means? And maybe we'll even get into some of the artists who you look at who are thinking with this new material. But I just think it's such a good example of much of the work and theory that you're building here. If you can talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so plastic agglomerate was a term that was coined by Captain Charles Moore, Patricia Corcoran, and Kelly Jasvac, who are an activist, a geologist, and an artist team. And they had been invited by a couple of locals who live on Camilo Beach or near Camilo Beach in Hawaii to come and look to see what they've been finding, which was these conglomerations of plastic and rock and wooden debris that kind of look like a new kind of geologic entity. And they submitted this to the Geological Society of America, and that it was officially kind of recognized as a new geologic entity. It's not exactly a rock, but it's kind of like a rock. It's rock-like. And there's sort of two forms of it. One is like, a rock in the sense that you can pick it up and move it around. And then there's the ones that are in situ. So are really on the beach and can't be moved. And at first they thought, oh, well, this must be because of the volcanic activity in the area. That's the reason why so much of this plastic is melted. But then they discovered that actually it really had more to do with human campfires. And the reason why you end up with these things in the first place is that if you ever go to the beach, it's so much plastic. Like there basically is nothing but plastic almost on the beach at this point. And it's just because of the currents of the ocean, that particular place has always been the place that everything washed up, right? And what happens to be in the ocean now is a ton of plastic that you get from, sort of all over the world. And so it is this new form of rock-like substance that that I think really pushes us to think about what does this mean, right? Like if plastic is now fully embedded in the strata of the earth, there's no separating it out. There's no way of sort of taking it out and removing it and putting it in some kind of proper place. That's completely impossible. And so what can we learn from this, right? I mean, and I think that one of the things that we continuously need to relearn is that there is no separation between nature and culture, right? Like that the things that we think of as a kind of difference in these two areas, this substance is really showing us that is just flat out not the case. And what's actually interesting is that, then it's doing its own thing in the environment, right? Like it's providing habitat for other kinds of species. It's which isn't to say that it isn't to condone the amount of plastic that's accumulating on that beach, but I think it is to sort of ask after like what is happening now that this is there.
There's something, Heather, you do towards the end of the book, which I really appreciate. And it's when you talk about you're telling a few stories in the conclusion, and one of them is about your own escape from wildfires and a kind of hot summer into a kind of an idyllic sort of camping trip and canoeing trip in Quebec. And what I appreciate is something you sort of say, and everywhere I went, I shed tiny pieces of all these fabrics to kind of detail all the different materials, the canoe, everything you're wearing, everything you're sort of bringing with you. And something I think a lot about, because in some ways, some of the artists who work through plastics and really think through them, someone we all know, Marina Zurko, who has affected my thinking about this a lot, that project she did with Sarah Rothberg, Immortal Plastics, a kind of assessment, right? How much plastic is on and around you? Something I ask students I teach to do, and not as a sort of shaming gesture, not as a I will now rid myself of all plastics, because I'm also incredibly mindful, especially given your expertise in plastics relationship to media in a very broad sense, but also to specifically communications media. When I think about the plastic keyboard that let me get to the Zoom screen. Oh wait, which is a mostly plastic monitor. I'm wearing a plastic headset, a mostly plastic headset. When I think about all those things, it's part of this task of living with, right? Not simply skating into the kind of escapism of apocalypticism or a kind of fake techno-utopianism, which is just sort of assessing and understanding how much we're ourselves and all the microplastics coursing through our bodies already, how intimately bound up we are with plastics. And again, I so really appreciate that gesture towards the end. It's a way of just taking stock. And then it's only from there that you can actually start to think, well, what does this mean? And like, what's that future look like, given this kind of intimate relationship with plastics, which mostly we want to think about as the sort of the clean, the disposable, the away from us.
Mhm. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, it's just really showing us, like I appreciate those people who are like, okay, I'm going to individually try to lead a plastic-free life. Like I appreciate that gesture, right? Like I think we're all doing whatever we can under the circumstances that we have. I personally think that maybe there's more valuable things that one could do with one's time, but if that's what really gives somebody a lot of joy, then they should go off and do that. But the thing I've always been really skeptical of is like, I don't understand how they did that. Like, did they take all the latex paint off of their walls? Did they unvarnish their floors? Did they not use any digital technologies? Did they, like, it's just like, they don't have eyeglasses, like there's just so many things that it starts to become absurd if you actually really think about it. And for me, I think that one of the things that is um, both maybe relieving, but also terrifying in sort of realizing how much plastic is embedded in our everyday infrastructure is that it really isn't about our individual choices, right? Like this is not a consumer level problem. This is an infrastructural level problem that needs to be addressed at the level of infrastructure. And so, in some ways it's like, okay, yeah, so you went out and you bought 4 like plastic toothbrushes. That's really like, it's fine. Like it's, if that's what you did, that it's like completely okay. Like in terms of the scale of the problem, that is not what, that's not what is, it's not what's gonna tip the balance here. And and then I think what is actually interesting in terms of what can tip the balance is like, really building relationships. It's building relationships with each other. It's building relationships with communities that are affected. It's building relationships with people who work in plastics factories. It's building relationships so that we can build sustainable movements so that people can begin to assess and then address the problems as we're encountering them, which is on this much kind of like larger scale of infrastructure. And I think that, yeah, I mean, for me, I also love Marina's work and the way that she goes about thinking about things. And I think that one of the things I really appreciate about her and her work is that it doesn't come from this point of view of sort of individual purity and trying to cleanse oneself of something, but rather is really about like, look, we're all enmeshed in these systems. So now that we are all enmeshed in these systems, what is it that we can do, right? What are the forms of being with each other that are going to be less harmful? What are the ways that we can build something that feels good to more people and more beings in the world?
What a perfect place to wrap up. And unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think that gives us hope to think about ways we can work together in these systems. So Dr. Heather Davis is the author of Plastic Matter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really
Great to
appreciate
talk
it.
to you.
Great to talk to you both.
We'll now go to our researcher, Sienna, who has an update on how you can get involved this week in Houston.
Hey everyone, this is Sienna coming to you with some upcoming opportunities to get involved. If you're looking for a meaningful way to spend your Tuesday mornings, look no further than the Environmental Institute of Houston's Water Smart Habitat Volunteer Program at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. Every Tuesday from 9 to 11 a.m., they offer the opportunity to get involved right there on the UH Clear Lake campus. Whether you're seeking community service hours or simply a change of pace, the Water Smart Habitat welcomes volunteers of all backgrounds and experience levels. As a habitat volunteer, you'll play a vital role in maintaining their outdoor spaces. Tasks can include weeding and mulching flower beds, planting native plants, maintaining pathways, trimming trees and bushes, and even assisting with pond cleanouts on select work days. Here's the best part. No experience is necessary. They'll provide all the guidance you need, and you're welcome to bring your own tools or use theirs. And don't forget to bring a reusable water bottle, hat, and sunscreen to stay hydrated and protected while you work. Please note that volunteers must be 18 or older to participate in the Environmental Institute Houston's workdays, unless prior arrangements have been made. And groups are also welcome, so if you're interested in bringing your organization or scheduling a group on a different day, just give Wendy Russell a call at 281-283-3045 or email reistle@uhcl.edu. So mark your calendars, gather your friends, and join them at the North Office Annex Building 1 on the UH Clear Lake campus. They're located at 2700 Bay Area Boulevard, so enter entrance 1 and follow the signs, or use entrance 3 and head to parking lot D4. They can't wait to see you there.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about urban planning. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Before we conclude, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in our February fund drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. In the coming weeks, we'll talk about urban planning, carbon capture and storage, and new environmental initiatives happening around town. If you want to become a station sustainer, ask about our memory bricks, permanent inscribed tributes to your generosity here at the studio. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn about all the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We're delighted to bring you important conversations about environmental and climate issues here in Houston and beyond on Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please, call 713-526-KPFT, make a one-time or sustainer donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help us keep ad-free public radio on the air here in Houston. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.